this occasion, this conference has a special meaning for me for two reasons. Because of the place, Yad Vashem is the World Center for the Remembrance of the Shoah. Heidelberg is the World Center for the Remembrance of the Sinti and Roma Holocaust, and the work of the Romani Rose himself, but also the team Herbert from Reuter, working with him from the beginning, and then also the development of the Research Center on Anti-Gypsyism, and the work of those who organized this conference from the Critical Film and Image Hub, my dear colleagues, Radmila, Andra, Jonathan, Lisa, Sandra. Thank you very much for making this possible. The second issue, because I'm really happy to be here discussing with you this topic, is because of the context. There are at least two elements that I think give relevance and pertinence to this conference. It's the issue of the post-memory. So there are different studies. The first one that was launched in a PhD thesis in 2011 by Alice Bartenstein in a thesis titled In the Presence of the Past, Third Generation of Germans and the Cultural Memory of National Socialism and the Holocaust. And it does not analyze third-generation survivors, but third-generation descendants of those who either were Nazi perpetrators or Nazi bystanders. And the conclusion is that, meanwhile, third-generation survivors has a kind of excessive memory, because of the ritualization of the memory inside the family. The whole identity of survivors, first generation, second generation, and third generation, it has been built memory and identity around the tragedy of the Holocaust. And so it's very much internalized. This is how they understand their position in history, but also their position in the world. Contrary, if we look to third generation Germans and Austrians who are descendants of Nazi perpetrators or Nazi bystanders, there is a huge silence there. So, and the conclusion is like, it was not us, but some crazy governors who were at the top of the Nazi bureau. And this gap of memory between the third generation survivors and the descendants of the perpetrators, is what we have to address in today's world. This is from a social perspective. Then, from a political perspective, is the area of post-truth. Genocide deniers, they don't deny anymore the very fact of the Holocaust. But what they deny is the historical meaning of the Holocaust. Or they say, okay, we cannot deny that the Holocaust is a historical fact, but it was a tiny part of the Second World War. If we compare with the general catastrophe, general figures of death in the front lines of the Second World War, the Holocaust was not that important. So genocide and Holocaust deniers, politically, what they do is try to deviate the attention, and to minimize the historical and moral meaning of the Holocaust. And the third question is about culture. How culture has the responsibility to find a common ground, between the gap of different memories in order to build a public memory. And in this sense is when film, documentary film, but also fiction drama film, has a mission in society, both as a machinery of empathy making, but also as a machinery of truth making. And this is what I will try to address in my speech, and this is also what will split the two sessions after. One focus on the documenting, archiving, and communicating the Holocaust, and the other more about the aesthetic part of films and the capacity of films of mobilizing moral emotions, moral sentiments. Now, about the presentation. So filming the abyss, I will explain later what I mean by the abyss. And decoding the uncounted Holocaust. What is the uncounted Holocaust? There are two people that share common destiny at a certain point of history, but then there is a divergent process of memorialization and divergent process of institutionalization of memory. And this is what I will try to explain through the analysis of different documentaries about the Holocaust. The Jewish Holocaust, Shoah, and the Roma Holocaust. But first allow me to raise some question about the value of film to communicate and to teach. This is about critical film theory, critical film literacy. Yeah? How do films and documentaries shape the ways we access and interpret history? When I say we, I don't refer as us, like experts, historians, but like the average citizens, this kind of popular history and popular culture. How do we make accessible history to the average common citizens? What role does cinema play in forming collective memory? And how do cinematic techniques guide viewers' ethical understanding of past atrocities, the role of the montage, of the narrative framing, of the selection of the interviewees? And how far can film affect whether genocide is publicly acknowledged or denied? Now, talking about the abyss, this is about the meaning, the historical and moral meaning of the Holocaust. Why, despite what genocide deniers say, minimizing the historical meaning and the historical importance of the Holocaust, still is a valid topic to analyze, to teach, and to educate about. Because it was in the 20th century, the worst moment in which Europe and the world experienced the reduction of human beings to number and labor units. The systematic erasure of dignity and identity. So human dignity was humiliated, it was violated in the Holocaust. And then the destruction of personhood and the conditions, the very foundations of being human, and the planned annihilation of entire peoples and entire cultural worlds. That does not exist anymore in Europe. Think about the Yiddish culture, for example, the Yiddish world. Now also the importance, not only the moral importance of the Holocaust, but also the importance, the historical importance of the Holocaust, the legal importance and the political importance of the Holocaust. Think about the impact in international law. It was such a breakthrough. We understand international legislation in a different manner from the point of the Holocaust. So the Holocaust exposed the limits of the nation state as a guarantor of human dignity. So we start to think rule of law beyond the sovereignty and the jurisdiction of the nation state. And it led to the formulation of crimes against humanity as a legal category. Think about the Nuremberg trials that I will analyze later. The definition of genocide by Raphael Lemkin that asserted the equal and inherent dignity of every person. And then the post-war legal and moral frameworks aim to establish collective responsibility, global responsibility to prevent future atrocities. So the whole idea of preventing non-recurrence of the genocide. Now, from the Holocaust, let's say that it could be considered a national story to think in the Holocaust as a global problem, a global ethics problem. The Holocaust as a rupture in global history and moral consciousness. Memory as a condition of prevention. That's why it's important to do research on Holocaust, to communicate about Holocaust, and to educate critically about Holocaust. And this responsibility that we have as scholars and activists of vigilance and ethical responsibility, of prevention and protection as obligations grounded in memory, grounded in remembrance, and the protection of vulnerable communities as an ongoing task beyond Europe, beyond Europe. Yeah, so that's why it's a global moral learning. First of all, how film was used to document, to archive the Holocaust. First of all, it was in the Nuremberg trials, court trials, very important, not only truth commissions, but court trials and the spectacularization of court trials, yeah? Starting from the Nuremberg trials, yeah, that was filmed by the U.S. Army Signal Corps and Pictorial Service during the proceeding of the trials, and the footage intended initially to be a legal evidence and archival record, rather than public education and communication or memorialization. So the Nuremberg lesson for today, assembled from trial footage, but circulation was restricted in those times. Of course, there was partially broadcasted by television and media, but it was quite restricted. And the television, the documentary remained largely inaccessible for decades. Yeah? A complete restoration and wider release only appeared in 2010. Yeah? This is also how we relate with film materials from a historical perspective. And the entire political context is operating, yeah, in filming, documenting, archiving, communicating, teaching about the Holocaust. And since 2000, extensive digital restoration and online access. You have them in the US Holocaust Memorial Center, but also in the National Archive record of the United States. And this is another question I will talk about here. It's about the ownership of the archive, and therefore the ownership on the narrative. Yeah? That's why it was so important for Romani Rose to have access to the National Archive of the Nazi regime. And still he's recovering. It's an ongoing process, yeah, of taking ownership on the archive in order to build narrative, and from building narrative, building collective memory. Now, if we talk about purely a documentary, one of the first one of the most important with global impact, it was Nuit Bruyère by Alain René. Yesterday we were talking a bit about it. I will try to go a bit more in depth. That was a script narrated by Jean Cayrol, a survivor of Mauthausen, a member of the French resistance during the Nazi occupation. And it was commissioned, here again, the political dimension of filming, documenting, archiving, communicating the memory of the Holocaust was commissioned by Le Comité d'Histoire de la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, okay, meaning the History Committee of the Second World War, by France, the government of France. And it was produced in France during a period of silence and censorship about the Vichy collaboration. Yeah? L'occupation was still politically sensitive, still today is, for France. And it was premiered first at Cannes in 1956 and later used in schools, universities, and anti-fascist activism from the 60s to the 80s. So not only the film production, but equally important, distribution, communication, education about film materials, and concretely documentary materials. And then the role of television. Yeah? So a film is really successful when it reaches the living room of the global family. Yeah, when you can make it from cinemas to television, then you will have a proper reach out, yeah, and proper access to people's mind. And television broadcasts vary. Initially, it was limited, but then it became like a foundational work for public Holocaust memory, especially once included in the national curricula of France and Belgium. Filming material, broadcasting, recording, mise en scène. I forgot to say something about the Nuremberg trials. What was important, if we compare the testimonies of the Roma survivors and the testimonies of the Jewish survivors, starting already from the court trials of Nuremberg, the testimonies of the not only the Jewish survivors, but all the survivors, very few that give testimony, because the Nuremberg trials were based basically on archives and testimonies of the perpetrators, not much the testimonies of the victims. Yeah, but still, the testimony, the narration was coordinated by the prosecutors first, and then also by the lawyers, yeah, that were part of the accusation. So it was not an improvised testimony of the survivors. Yeah, there was a strategy behind, a legal strategy. Yeah, part of the court trials. The second important filming material is in the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem. Yeah, it was really a spectacularization of the trial. Yeah, this was like totally recorded, broadcasted, alive, not only in Israel, that was almost 24 hours broadcasted in the television, but also elsewhere, like journalists from all over the world, BBC, CBC, from France, from Germany, going there and taking notes and then publishing in the respective countries. Yeah? The trial took place at a moment when Israel was beginning to shift from a public culture of silence about survivors to one that centered their testimonies as a national memory. And this is an important shift, yeah, because this was already differently to the court trials of Nuremberg. Here, this was part of the narration of a nation. Yeah? So the state of Israel was already founded, constructed the trial of Eichmann as a part of the narration of the nation. And differently to the Nuremberg trials, where few survivors give a testimony, here massive survivors give testimony, around 100. Yeah? And it was already not only coordinated by the accusation, prosecutors, lawyers, but also Yad Vashem was already created, yeah, since 1953. So it was a collective narration of the nation, coordinated strategically by different actors, not only with a legal purpose, yeah, but far more. Yeah, it was the mise en scène of the memory of the survivors, changing how the Holocaust was discussed in Israeli society and in the global society, in the global public opinion. Internationally, the televised images circulated across Europe, United States, making the trial a global media event and placing the Holocaust at the center of post-war historical consciousness, moral consciousness, political consciousness. And the trial confronted audiences with Eichmann's bureaucratic ordinariness and raising the question that articulated by Hannah Arendt in this book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, and the concept of the banality of evil, yeah, that spread the responsibility beyond the Nazi bureau, yeah, making the complicity of a lot of public functionaries, but also the banality of evil was capillarized in the wider society. And for many viewers, the survivor testimonies represented a new moral and emotional language. Yeah? They learned in these years yeah, from the very happening of the Holocaust, Nuremberg trials, the Nuit Brouillard documentary, until the Eichmann trial. Yeah, they learn how to narrate. Yeah, they learn how to build public memory. And the shift in Holocaust memory from documents and numbers, yeah, this is also a fundamental difference. If we see Nuit Brouillard, it is all about death. Death, death, death. It's the trains, it's the transportation of victims, it's the piles of the properties of the victims. Yeah, it's about the machinery of industrial death. Here it's different. It's about the power of testimonies. Yeah, it's about the dignity of the survivors. So I will compare a bit the Nuremberg trial and the Eichmann trial. Yeah, almost 20 years difference. Yeah, the context of media and technology. In the Nuremberg trials, technology was not yet a mass international medium capable of continuous broadcasting, continuous transmission, while in the Eichmann trial, the international news network could distribute recorded materials alive. Then the issue of broadcasting the live television broadcast, in the case of the Nuremberg trials, it was really restricted. It was not widely publicized. In the meantime, in the Eichmann trial, it was broadcasted live in Israel, recorded sessions widely distributed internationally. The primary visual record in the Nuremberg trial that was filmed by the US Army Signal Corps for Evidence and Archive. Yeah? So the purpose was not to distribute and to communicate and to educate, but rather to document and archive what happened in the Holocaust. Meanwhile, in the Eichmann trial that was filmed by Capital Cities Broadcasting, property of the USA government, under the filmmaker Leo Hurwitz, using 29 cameras in the courtroom. So this is the level of spectacularization of a public trial. And how did the public saw it? Yeah, it was in the Nuremberg trial was shown later. Yeah, in cinema also, newsreels and reported via radio, newspaper. So it was quite edited, quite controlled. In the meantime, in the Eichmann trial, it was broadcasted by the Israel Broadcasting Authority, and also distributed by CBC, NBC, ABC, CBC, BBC, the European Broadcasting Union, so worldwide. And the public awareness, yeah, in the Nuremberg trial, the Holocaust was presented as a state crime, yeah? But survivor voices were not central to the reception and the perception of the Holocaust in those times, because they wanted to prove the responsibility, the legal and criminal responsibility of the perpetrators. In the Eichmann trial, there is a shift, there is a turn in communication, and brought survivor testimony into the front line, into the living rooms worldwide, reshaping a global understanding of the Holocaust. Now, I want to talk about another major piece, filming piece about the Holocaust, that is Shoah. Yeah, Shoah from Hebrew, meaning catastrophe, devastation. For some, it has a secular term emphasizing absolute destruction, but it also appears in the prophecy of Isaiah 56:5. Yeah, when he talks about those who suffered the catastrophe, I will make a place for them in my house, giving them memory and name. Yeah, memory and name. Yad Vashem. The term Holocaust, yeah, here talking about semantics and terminology, as you know, Holocaustos, yeah, it's holos, all. Kaustos is burned by fire, but it has also a biblical meaning, like a sacrifice, a ritual, this religious dimension of the Holocaust, originally meaning a burnt offering or a sacrificial fire, but can imply religious or sacrificial connotations. In the case of the Shoah, it doesn't have this connotations of being a sacrifice, but still it has a biblical etymology. Shoah is more common, the Holocaust is more common in the general public, Shoah is more common in a specialized public, and also in the Jewish community. About the film, the documentary itself, directed by Claude Lasman, a Jewish member of the French resistance as a teenager during the Nazi occupation. It was filmed during 11 years, so imagine 11 years production, selecting the interviewees, traveling around the world, building the context and the framing, the strategy to produce a documentary. And it was filmed across different countries, Poland, Israel, Germany, Austria, and the United States. The survivors, they talk in the mother tongue. Some of them talk in Yiddish, some of them talk in the respective languages of their country, but quite a few of them talk in Hebrew. So there is a powerful dimension, again here, how a nation is narrating itself in the ongoing process of the nation building of Israel. It's quite a long film, 9.5 hours, but entirely from the survivors, witness and perpetrators' testimony, without archival images. So there is an aesthetic decision here. This is not anymore about the archive, what Jacques Derrida talked, mal d'archive, archive fever. So not anymore about the importance of the archive, but let's listen how survivors experience. This is a personal, a human experience among all. So they are already moving from the facts to the meaning of the Holocaust, especially the moral meaning of the Holocaust, through this very important, crucial, maybe the most important documentary is Shoah, that argue that the Holocaust cannot be reconstructed from the archive. Instead, it must be recalled through voices, places, and the ethical presence of the testimonies, the ethical presence of the witness. And it was released in cinemas in 1985 and then televised, very important. For me, this is very important. When a movie or documentary is televised, you really are reaching people's mind and people's hearts. In 1987 and 88 in France, and then the UK, the US, and Israel. It's very interesting that Israel was the later, but they were kind of packaging and framing in an educational format. So the European public broadcasters, including Antenne 2 in France and also in Germany, and the Israeli broadcasting was made by the Israeli Broadcasting Authority, kind of state control of the narrative of the Holocaust here again, that participated later for broadcast rather than the production, although it was also involved in the production, because Yad Vashem assisted by providing archival guidance, survivor contacts. This is very important when you do research. How do you contact the survivors? How do you collect the testimonies? Yad Vashem play an important role here. In two senses. One, providing access to the survivors, but also preparing the survivors how to talk in public, such a historical trauma. So it was a bit of script, a bit of guidance, a bit of a strategic decision behind. And when the film was complete in 1985, the year where I was born, Europe and the United States were already in a phase of expanding Holocaust memory in the public culture. So the educational context varied. And in Israel, public discourse still emphasized resistance, state building, and heroism. So this was a paradigm shift, sure. Long survivor testimony still was less central, but became really central from this very moment. And for this reason, Shoah premiered first in Paris in 1985 and circulated internationally before its broader reception in Israel. Yeah? So they have to prepare the public, the audience of Israel, to understand, to interpret, and to embed this narrative. And it was screened in Israel Cinematheques in 1987, 2 years later, in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, and the television broadcast followed in 1988, 3 years later, and was controlled by the Israeli Broadcasting Authority, and shown in several parts with educational framing and public discussion, what we did yesterday here. Yeah, so framing a big generation and preparing the public with discussions, with debate, with explanations. And the broadcast was presented as an ethical, educational, and national responsibility. And for many viewers, it was the first time that they encountered extended, intimate survivor testimony. So the intimacy of this documentary, it is very different if we compare to the previous filming documents on the Holocaust. Yeah, the film shifted Israel memory culture from focus on heroism and national rebirth to mourning, loss, and the voices of the survivors. The dignity in resistance, yeah, the dignity in the resilience of the survivors. And the Shoah played a major role in making survivor testimony central to public and educational Holocaust remembrance in Israel and in the globe. Then who appeared here? This is also very important in terms of strategic decisions. So it appeared Jewish survivors of the ghettos and extermination camps, members of the Sonderkommando, testimonies from Shelmo, Treblinka, Auschwitz, Polish non-Jewish witness, like normal people who were witness of what's going on around, local residents and villages, railway workers involved in the deportation routes. So it tried to cover the entire system of the Holocaust, yeah, the machinery of death, through testimonies. This is the breakthrough of this documentary. Observers of the genocide in everyday proximity, German and Austrian perpetrators. Majority of those who appear here appear with name and surname. Yeah, so they try to give a concrete identity, yeah, showing that it was founded in personal responsibility in the end, so human-centered. Former SS guards and camp personnel, administrative and logistical planners, we have to take into consideration that Shoah already learned from the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem. Local intermediaries and collaborators, auxiliary police and interpreters in the occupied Poland, and then individuals facilitating surveillance, enforcement, and deportation. Now, allow me to synthesize a bit the accumulated knowledge, yeah, from the Nuremberg trials that were filmed and partially broadcasted until the Shoah. Yeah? If we see the aim of the Nuremberg trials film was to establish legal responsibility for Nazi crimes using official documentations and evidence. In the Nuit Brouillard, Night and Fog, it was to confront the post-war Europe with the memory of the camps through poetic reflection and visual contrast between past and present. While in Eichmann trial was to give public voice to the survivors and to demonstrate Eichmann's specific role in the machinery of deportation, planification, extermination. And in the Shoah, there is a, I would say, aesthetic and epistemic turn shift. The aim was to preserve Holocaust memory through living testimony without archival footage, ensuring that memory survives through the voices of the survivors. Then the evidence in the Nuremberg trials was basically the documents and records, administrative orders, capture files, film, photos, official testimonies. While in Night and Fog, it is the archival footage, and it makes a contrast between contemporary color footage and of abandoned camps accompanied by a narration. So there is a narrator in the Night and Fog, this authoritative voice. There is not in the Shoah. In the Shoah, there is not a narrator. Yeah? There is a collection, a mosaic of voices from the survivors, but also from the perpetrators. And in the Eichmann trial, it's basically the survivor testimony. This is the central evidence, supported by documents and also the entire legal proceedings of the trials. Yeah. In the Nuremberg trials, the survivors was not central to the entire process. Really few of them, no more than 15. Yeah. In Night and Fog, no direct survivor in interviews. It's all about images, documents, the narration, but no testimonies at all. What in Eichmann is the greatest collection of testimonies of survivors, around 100. In Shoah is also around 19, yeah? Not like 10 survivors. The role of the survivors in the Nuremberg trials was secondary. Yeah? In the Night and Fog is not existent at all. Yeah? What in Eichmann and Shoah is central to the production of the memory. Then about the style, the tone of the narrative in Nuremberg trial, it was formal, procedural, it was judicial tone. In the Night and Fog, it was quite poetic, yeah? Evocative, not spoken the survivors, but it was presented to the narration of the expert. In the Eichmann, the testimonies were central and were quite emotional. So for the first time, it was an emotional encounter, not only by the Israeli society, but the entire world with the testimonies of the survivors. Same in the Shoah. And then if we talk about the public memory in the Nuremberg trials, they try to establish the Holocaust as a state-organized genocide, so a state responsibility proven through official evidence. In Night and Fog, it highlights the scale of the atrocities, what we call the industry of massive murders. In Eichmann, they introduced the Holocaust debate in the global public opinion, and the Shoah cemented the idea that memory must be spoken or will disappear. What I want to show here is that there are some continuities, but also ruptures, yeah, in epistemic terms, but also in aesthetic terms. And in these years, almost 40 years, there were already an accumulation of knowledge that is going on. It's being under process even today. Now, talking about the forgotten Holocaust, what I say, the uncounted Holocaust. As I said before, even if the Roma, Sinti, and the Jewish, they share a common destiny at a certain point of history, then there is a divergent process of memorialization and divergent institutionalization of memory. And many times, quite often, the memory of the Roma and Sinti Holocaust has been dissociated from the general history of the Holocaust. Yeah? And this dissociation is what this documentary, quite late, if we compare, tried to fill this gap in 1989. The importance of this documentary is that it was made by BBC, and as you know, the BBC is the most global broadcasting corporation. There is no other, well, now Al Jazeera maybe, but in those times it was the only one that has this global dimension of communication. Yeah. The director, George Case, was a British journalist and documentary filmmaker for the BBC. It's rather short if we compare with Shoah. It's less than an hour. And it's one of the earliest English language documentaries to address the Romani genocide directly. Of course, before there were in the 80s some German documentaries, but if we think in global terms, yeah, the impact in the global public opinion, this was the first one. And it highlights the erasure of Roma and Sinti suffering from mainstream Holocaust memory. We were talking yesterday about inclusive narrative. Yeah? We can talk also about solidarity narrative. interethnic narrative, but also processes of self-representation. We talk about the positionality in the discourse theory. And this makes us a sense on how these elements work when we talk, we research and educate about the history of the Holocaust. And challenges the narrative that treat the Holocaust exclusively as a Jewish tragedy. So it kind of try to have like a broader composition of the memory of the Holocaust, and addresses the continued discrimination and racism against Roma communities in post-war Europe as an ongoing process of discrimination. The difference between Forgotten Holocaust and Shoah is that Forgotten Holocaust doesn't put names, when the survivors give the testimony. It tries to make like a collective memory without putting emphasis in the concrete individuals, concrete persons. But still, I could recognize some of them because they are quite famous, and you might know them, like Seja Stoica, like Romney Lobara from Austria, survivor. She was in different concentration camps, including Auschwitz, and she has made a lot of exhibitions as an artist. This artistic dimension of Holocaust education, Holocaust communication. Otto Rosenberg, a German Sinti survivor, Franz Rosenberg, but there are quite a few more. It's a really good piece. Then the aspect of the perpetrators' interviews, they are not interviewed in this document, in the Forgotten Holocaust. There is an explanation. The film uses documents and archival sources to explain the role of the perpetrators. It's focused on Roma and Sinti communities, primarily German and Austrian, but also French, Romanian, Hungarian. And what is interesting is that most of them, they talk in Romani. So this capacity of survivors, like keepers of the alive culture, including language as a central component of any culture and identity. And then it shows also the life before the war and the life after the war, giving a sense of the continuum of survivor. Like even if the Nazis tried to exterminate not only an entire people, but also its culture, here what they do is they try to show that there is a continuum, thanks to the survivor, preserving the culture and the way of living of Roma and Sinti communities. And there is a minimal use of archival footage. So it's mainly about using the survivor testimony. And the documentary does not include direct on-camera interviews with Nazi perpetrators. As I said before, it shows the archival documents, racial classification charts, so it's quite educational material in this sense. It highlights that genocide of Roma and Sinti was bureaucratically and politically organized in the same way that Shoah was. It was not improvised or incidental. And there is a focus in the administrative machinery of persecution. Local police, racial hygiene files and offices, transport authorities, and the SS camp system. But there is a learning process here, already from the Nuremberg trials to different documentaries. They can learn a lot how to film, document, communicate, and teach about the Holocaust, in this case about the Sinti and Roma Holocaust. And emphasizing documents rather than interviews with the perpetrators, and the absence of perpetrators' voices contrast with the centrality of survivor testimony in this document. Now, people Uncounted. I wanted to have this comparative analysis before I decode this documentary that I think is the most complete documentary on Sinti and Roma Holocaust. The director is Jewish ally, Aaron Jaeger, a Canadian filmmaker. The film is around an hour and a half, 99 minutes, and the documentary was draws on transnational fieldwork across Europe and North America. So there is an echo of Shoah here, like recording in different places, recording different testimonies, and reflecting the global dispersion, the global character of the Roma and Sinti culture community. So it was shot in Romania, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, Auschwitz-Birkenau, Germany, the Central Council, France, Serbia, Croatia, Austria, Italy, Canada, so framing the diaspora perspective, and the United States. And it highlights that Roma history are not confined to single territory, but shaped by migration, displacement, and international struggles for recognition. So here there is a clear interethnic solidarity. There is a clear intention of building an inclusive narrative. There is narrative solidarity, inclusivity, but still there are asymmetries. Yeah? If we talk about self-representation, self-narration of a people, yeah? There is no ownership entirely. Partially, yes, yeah, because all the testimonies are about Roma survivors, Roma activists, Roma youth. Yeah? So there is a shared narrative, but there is the power position is different here. And then again, the strategic construction of the narrative, it was kind of absent here. If we compare with the Nuremberg trials, there was a really clear intention, a strategic legal intention in coordinating the testimonies, yeah, and the narratives. In the Shoah, the same. Yeah? Yad Vashem, the Israel Broadcasting Authority. With the Roma, there is such a lack of power, symbolic power, epistemic power, to coordinate this kind of self-narration of a people completely, if we talk about the Holocaust, but also if we talk about any other topic. So there is this kind of narrative chaos, yeah, this dispersion of improvised individual testimonies. Yeah, that is not the case if we analyze other documentaries talking about the Holocaust, where there is much more cohesive narrative, strategically designed from a political point of view, from an aesthetic point of view. So some key interviewees here, yeah, and this is also interesting how the director reached out and contacted the interviewees. It was through Roma organizations, yeah, through Roma activists. That there is not such a central hub like Yad Vashem that you can go there and they will give you knowledge, frame, contacts, networks. Yeah, this is more like a snowball strategy. Yeah, you contact one person, then another, and you reconstruct the entire narrative. But it is a really beautiful, in terms of music, documentary, but also very strong speakers there. Yeah, Seija Stoiker, Ian Hancock, Romani Rose himself, Sheila Salo and Ronald Lee, and few Roma youth that are friends. Now, key themes, yeah, so the long historical continuity, even before the Second World War, yeah, long before. So it shows what we can say a kind of common tropes between anti-Gypsyism and anti-Semitism, yeah, almost already from the Middle Ages. And it shows how persecution is not episodic, but is systemic and continuous over centuries. And it links slavery in Romania, forced settlement laws, racial science, Holocaust extermination, and post-war marginalization into one historical trajectory. Then the transnational context is very important because it gives a global dimension to the purpose of Holocaust education, demonstrate that Roma identity and persecution are not confined to any single nation state, but is filmed across Central Eastern Europe, Western Europe, North America, the Balkans, yeah? This kind of unity in a radical diversity, and highlights how laws, policing, and social exclusion vary by country, but share common patterns across places, across history. More themes, the paradigms for Roma Holocaust. And here the figures Again, the debate about figures, if in the Forgotten Holocaust 1988, it says that it is 250,000 victims, here the figures change and it says it's 500,000. Yeah, this is always, it will be always a debate, yeah, with figures. And it shows the deportation to Auschwitz and other camps, including the liquidation of the Sigeunerlager, the Roma family camp on 2nd of August, and the fight for the recognition of this day as a World Holocaust Day, Roma Holocaust Day. And then the entire issue of anti-Gypsyism, across time, across Spain, and it reveals how anti-Roma racism persists despite changes in government, territory, political regimes, yeah? The continuity despite mutations, and connect fascist racial policies to contemporary far-right movements, forced evictions, and school segregation. It was such an issue in Hungary in those days, the mass killings also in North Hungary. And it shows violence not as a past event, but as a continuing social and political reality. The testimony approach, yeah? The film foregrounds survivor testimony as its narrative center. Yeah? So the accumulative knowledge is operating here again. And the interviews take place in ordinary rooms, at the kitchen tables, in community centers, and the sites where families once lived or were taken from. So trying to build the intimacy of the personal spaces of the interviewees. And perpetrators are not confronted as personalities, same that in the Forgotten Holocaust, and they appear through documents, laws, police files, and bureaucratic routines. And the film avoids the guiding voice of a narrator, similar in the Shoah. There is not an authoritative narrator in the documentary, but it's the music, what is guiding the document, and also the voices of the interviewees, few of them survivors. And the absence of a didactic narrator ensures that interpretation arises through the act of listening. So it obliges the spectator, the audience, to be an active listener and to compose the meaning of the narration, positioning the viewer as a responsible witness of history. And I will end with this amazing table. So the main documentary, Night and Fog, in 1956. Yeah? Then Shoah in 1985, The Forgotten Holocaust, 1989, and A People Uncounted in 2011. As I has explained, yeah, they have different primary focus, different primary strategic aim and missions. Also, if we see who speaks there, how the archives are used there, the footage, the representation of perpetrators, the representation of victims varies from one to another, the cinematic and narrative approach, the montage, the narrative framing, and then who are the key contributors. Yeah, it depends very much on the political shifting moments, also on the power capacity of the communities involved, geopolitical shift, geopolitical momentum, and also to issues connected to nation-building processes and memory-building processes. Thank you very much for your attention. That's all from my side.